Thank you everyone for being here today with us this afternoon. I'm going to start with some housekeeping while we wait for more folks to join us. Just thank you so much for being here with us. The structure of this event will first be introductions. We will play the book trailer for The Whispers of a Distant God, and then a conversation with David Gersh, and lastly, some time to take questions and comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to type in your concern in the chat box. I'll assist you there. To ask a question or make a comment, you can raise your hand to be unmuted to ask yourself, or you can type it in the chat box or the Q&A, and we will address them at the appropriate time. Let me first start out by introducing David Gersh. He's a published poet and award-winning author of 7 books. Open Books published his last 3 books, including his latest, The Whisper of a Distant God. He is an avid student of Civil War history. Mr. Gersh received his bachelor's degree with honors and his MBA from UCLA. He was awarded his JD cum laude from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. He spent 36 years in the practice of corporate and securities law, negotiating, structuring, and executing complex corporate transactions. He is a retired partner of Paul Hastings, one of the renowned international law firms. He participated on behalf of Frank Sinatra in the sale of Warner Brothers Studios to Kinney National Corporation to create what is now Time Warner. And he was lead counsel to the British company TVS Entertainment in its acquisition of MTM Entertainment, for whom he acted as outside general counsel for more than 5 years until its sale to the Family Channel. Mr. Gersh is a past member of the Executive Committee of the Business Law Section of the State Bar of California. He chaired the committee that drafted the revised California Limited Partnership Act. He is chairman emeritus of Board of Directors of the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra and past president of the Los Angeles Hillel Council. In addition, he is vice chairman of the board of United West Labs, a laboratory outreach provider. The Whisper of a Distant God, the untold story of the Angel of Santa Fe and the Gettysburg of the West. This is the story based on historical events of the little-known War of New Mexico of Henry Sibley, who commanded the Texas Mounted Volunteers, Edward R.S. Canby, the Union commander, and his wife, Louisa, the Angel of Santa Fe. The Angel of Santa Fe was an extraordinary woman, and her story is extraordinary. Louisa Canby was either a hero or a traitor to the Union. The Whisper of a Distant God explores the desperate struggle at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, called the Gettysburg of the West, and the men who fought on both sides. It examines the tragedies of war and the passion and compassion of those men and women who played a part. Through letters, diaries, newspaper articles, and both first and third person exposition and dialogue, this deeply researched historical fiction tells of those who heard the whisper of a distant God. I'm going to now play a book trailer for Whisper of a Distant God. Give me a moment as I share my screen. David, can you see that?
I can, yes.
Okay. That was a great book trailer. Did Open Books create that?
Yes, yes, they did. And Jessica, I want excuse me. I wanted to thank you for reading my resume. Every time I hear it, I feel like I want to know that guy.
Very impressive. You're an impressive guy.
No, not really.
Would you mind starting us out by telling us a little bit about your book and what led you to write it?
The Whisper of a Distant God is about the only campaign fought in the West. All the other battles were fought east of the Mississippi. The Confederacy hatched a plan to get the gold and silver from California and Nevada and Colorado and had to take New Mexico in order to do it. The campaign took place up from El Paso, up the Rio Grande River. And I wrote it because I'm a Civil War buff. I have read probably hundreds of books on the Civil War in my life, and I never knew about this battle. When I heard about it, I knew I had to write the book. I really started out wanting to write a history book, but it evolved because of lack of primary sources into a historical fiction. And I think that was great because I think the story is told better this way.
I agree. Would you mind giving our audience a little taste of the book by reading an excerpt?
Sure, I'm happy to. The book. Her headstone was simple gray granite, nothing fancy about it. How she'd have wanted it. Her name, Louisa Canby, was carved into the stone. Beneath it, the words, "The Angel of Santa Fe." Next to it was a larger, more ornate headstone inscribed Major General Edward R.S. Canby, U.S. Army. But Ezra spoke to Louisa. "It's Ezra Davis, ma'am. You won't remember me. There was lots of us, but I come this way because I had to say thank you for what you've done." He spoke aloud in a clear voice, as if he were speaking to his Texas boys back in New Mexico during the war. His teeth were yellowed and a few were missing toward the back. He rubbed at the gray stubble on his cheek with his left knuckles. "It was the newspaper that finally brought me, ma'am." He had been there for almost half an hour looking for the gravestone. Now the stump of his arm was beginning to throb, as it did sometimes when the weather was changing. "I don't read so good, but I looked right close at that paper, and darn if there weren't a picture of Henry Sibley, that son of a bitch, I beg your pardon, man, made himself out to be some kind of hero. And it talked about you too, ma'am. You passing on, I knew right then that I ain't done proper by you, knew I needed to come." He blinked at some dust that blew into his eyes. "We'd have starved or froze back there if it ain't been for you." He remembered her leaning over him, speaking in a soft voice, gently placing a wet towel on his forehead to try and break the fever. She was not pretty, a thickening woman, middle-aged even then, her hair parted and pulled tightly back in a bun, with a motherly way about her.
Thank you, David. So where did the title come from, The Whispers of this Distant God?
The North and the South both fervently believed that God favored their cause. Preachers preached it. More Americans died in the Civil War than every other war the United States has ever fought combined. More Americans died there than all the other deaths, all the wars combined. It seemed to me that if God favored one side over the other, it was the whisper of a distant God.
I like that. I mean, it's tragic, but that's powerful. How long was this writing process like? You're a Civil War buff, so you've
I am.
obviously been interested in this topic for a long time. How long have you been trying to write this book? What was your process like?
This book took me, as you said before, I've written several books. This book took me infinitely longer. Book took 5 years to write. And the reason it took 5 years to write were a couple of reasons. First, there was a huge amount of research that had to go in. Almost every single line had to be researched. For instance, I had to research what Santa Fe looked like in 1862, 61, which, by the way, was a little town of 2,200 people, that little dusty town. The other part of the problem that took so long is that I had to establish the characters in my head. The officers who fought the battles weren't difficult. I mean, they were military men. They were doing what they set out to do. You could surmise what they were thinking and how they were thinking strategically and what they wanted and what their goals were. In creating Louisa's voice and Ezra's voice, Ezra Davis's voice, is what took so long. For Louisa, I read for a whole year, I read diaries of Union and Confederate Civil War women to try to establish the voice. And when I finally got it, I knew I had it. It was just right. And I think that comes through in the book. Ezra is totally made up. He is a character. Everybody loves Ezra. I love Ezra. Ezra is just a Texas cracker who gets into the war because he wants to get himself a Yankee before the war is over because it's an adventure. It's not war. He learns a great deal about war during this time, but his voice seemed to come to me naturally. I was born in Atlanta, but I don't speak Southern. He came to me naturally the way he would. He seemed real and alive to me. And when the characters seem alive to me, I only have to picture the scene in my head and hear them talking, write it down, which I think is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, and that was something I wanted to ask. Ezra's voice came naturally to you, but all of your character's language is very authentic, each character. You created diary entries for your characters. And how did you decide how you would write your characters' voices, how each of them spoke? Maybe for the ones that didn't come as natural.
It was, as you say, this book was written in the form of, at least partly, in the form of diaries and reports and personal journals and articles. And the purpose, they took a long time because they had to be right and they had to move the story. Part of the problem with this book is that I needed to establish and make the characters real. And I did that through these diaries and notes because as you know, undoubtedly, in the 1850s, the United States Army, the standing army, was very small. There were only a few hundred officers, and they knew each other well, and they went in and out. Actually, one of the fascinating things about this book is that Henry Sibley, the Confederate commander, and Edward Canby, the Union commander, actually were friends. The Canbys had actually spent Christmas with the Sibleys one year. And they gave presents back and forth.
And so such a wild time in our history and fascinating. But yeah, you hear stories like that all the time, that they were family, they were friends. But just the way it all worked out. Do you have a favorite character in the book? One that you like to write the most in or get into the character the most?
I love Ezra. Ezra is rambunctious. He's caring. He goes from being a rowdy kind of teenager, 20 years old, to being in this adventure like a giant Boy Scout march, to really getting into war where people are getting killed in front of him, where his younger brother dies, and he gets his arm shot off. You see that evolve, but you also see the humanity in him. I think he is an extraordinarily humane character who I think grows in this book. That's why I love it.
Yeah. The story is all based on real events in your book.
Yes.
All of the characters based on real people as well?
No. The principal characters in the battles, the officers on each side, the actual battles themselves, Louisa Canby, what happened in Santa Fe, those are all real. The events are all real. But I wanted to tell the story from both the Union side and the Confederate side in a kind of personal way. And therefore I created Ezra and a soldier on the Confederate side who you really see in the thick of the battle, and who you see scared and afraid, and why they're doing it. The Civil War was fought for ideological reasons, obviously, but that wasn't the reason those men were out there fighting. They had no ideology. The officers were there to win, and the others were there because they wanted the adventure and they wanted to be men.
Yeah. From many of us that are joining today, I'm sure they really want to dive into how Santa Fe, New Mexico, plays a role in the book, and who is the Angel of Santa Fe?
Santa Fe, I'm so glad to do this particular library system, because Santa Fe is both the locus of the book and the center of, to me, what the book gets at, which is different, I think, than most Civil War history books. The North, obviously, Santa Fe is at the end of the Santa Fe Trail. There's a whole chapter on how the Santa Fe Trail was created and how Santa Fe became a major trading post during the 1850s. And as Santa Fe became more important and as people settled on the Santa Fe Trail, the Union created forts to protect them from the Indians. And the key fort was at the end of the Glorieta Pass, called Fort Union, which was the major supply depot. The Union realized that Santa Fe was indefensible and left to establish defensive positions around Fort Union. And they left behind the wives, which, and this is a fascinating thing to me. Life was chivalrous then. The officers left behind their wives, knowing that they'd be cared about in Santa Fe by the enemy and respected, which they were. And the wives, in their own way, tried to justify being kept and protected by doing what they could, whether it was nursing soldiers or other things. The key, the Battle of Glorieta Pass, which was the turning point of this campaign, was won by a fluke, a total fluke. The Union South won every battle going into it. They were going to win this battle and take over Fort Union. and by a fluke caused by a military error by the field commander of the Union Army, they destroyed the baggage train of the Southern troops. Now, and I'm sorry to go on this long about this, but this is a little kind of involved. But the way battles were fought in the Civil War was that when you're going into battle, you took 3 days rations, and you took a blanket, you took your gun and 3 days ammunition, and everything else was left on the baggage train, everything beyond 3 days. And when the baggage train was destroyed, the Southerners had nothing. They had to retreat. They had no provisions. They had no additional ammunition. They had nothing. And these boys, many of them barefooted, had to walk back, wounded or just tired, through the snow, through the Rocky Mountains in winter for days and days, and they died by the side of the road. Now, if you can picture this town of Santa Fe, where they all retreated to, there were surgical tents. And this is one of the vivid images that I remember from this book. It's actual historical tidbit. There were arms and legs amputated and piled outside the tent, thrown out of the tent. There were screams. There was no anesthetic. They were operated on without anesthetic. Bodies were piled up. These boys were destitute. They were suffering. Everything around Santa Fe, all the territory around Santa Fe had been stripped bare. There was no food. The officers were skimping on food, so you know there was no food. The boys had blankets, no blankets. They were freezing to death. They were starving to death. Louisa Canby, who was the wife of the Union commander, in an act which is extraordinary. I've never heard of anything like it. Now, she felt such compassion. She felt such sadness. She herself had lost her only child in 15 years before. She felt such compassion for these dying boys that she led the Confederates to where the Union had buried their excess supplies when they abandoned Santa Fe. And yes, they not only got food, they got blankets, they got ammunition too. And here's the cornerstone of this book. The very definition of a traitor in law is a person who gives aid and comfort to the enemy. That's absolutely true. She clearly was a traitor under the definition of law. In addition, there are moral questions that just abound here about unintended consequences, about how many Union soldiers died because she saved the lives of several, because they finally got to retreat. Most of them got back to Texas to fight again. I think I don't know how compassion plays into that. We all know of cases where somebody does something traitorous to the country because they're passionate about what they believe, and people have been executed for that. I don't, if I didn't know Louisa and I didn't know who she was and how she came to be that way, I might think she's a traitor too. I think everyone has to make that decision for themselves. But she was the angel of Santa Fe to the Confederates. She saved helpless boys' lives, and they loved her for it.
Did they ever find out she was the traitor?
Yes, she confessed to her husband what she had done, and for him, he stood beside her. He never disclosed what it was. And I think for him, it was a turning point for him too, because good and bad, right and wrong, for him, were determined by duty. For Louisa, it was determined by compassion. And he finally accepted that she could be a good person, even though she didn't fit his definition of duty. And she was never punished, by the way. She lived for many years and she died in her bed.
I'm glad she didn't get punished, but she was an angel to us, to many. So with all of your research and these diary entries, how did you go about doing your research? Was this something you've accumulated over the years from being a Civil War buff? Were there specific libraries or archives you had to try and access to get all the information you needed?
Well, first I bought about 50 books on the Civil War, relating either to incidents that took place, so I get real stories, real things. And as I said, I must have read dozens of Civil War diaries of women that I accumulated. Obviously, I spent a lot of time on Google, and it just wasn't about the characters. For instance, I didn't know, always wanted to know, but didn't know what a caisson was. Caisson's that thing they tow behind artillery, and it's really where they store the powder and the shells, and it's pulled by the horse, and the gun, rolls on behind it. And what kind of ammunition there was? The mini ball, which the Union used, is not a ball at all. It's a hollow lead projectile. What did Monterey look like in 1850? What did Santa Fe look like in 1850? How was the Santa Fe Trail founded? What drove people to found the Santa Fe Trail? What happened with the Indians? This was all, this took years of research, and I loved every minute of it because I love to do research. I love learning about those things. I thought that this was, for me, the two seminal events, the two most important events in the history of our country are the Revolution and the Civil War. And therefore, I spend a lot of time trying to read about them and learn about them, because the truth is so different than the mythology we're taught in history. We get we think George Washington was a god. If you read the history, he wasn't. He was a man. I like getting through that. I like cracking through that myth and learning both the ugly and human facts that go into this kind of stuff. And there really are, and they really, I think, suggest something far beyond just what they are. They tell us how to be, where we are, and why we're here.
What are some of the common mythology of the Civil War that you hear? What's the most frequent one that you hear?
Let me tell you a question I posed in the book at the back in my discussion notes, and it is startling to most people, but it's a very real question. When the South seceded from the Union, were they traitors? Now, I'm very glad the war came out the way it did. I'm very glad the Union won. Slavery was a horrible institution, terrible in all respects. But that's a different question than legality. If you think about it, the United States was formed by a bunch of independent countries, 13 of them, revolted against their king. Then those 13 countries came together and signed a deal, if you would, a contract. And some years later, some of those countries wanted to withdraw from the contract. It really is when it's viewed that way, you understand that the victors write the history.
So you started this to write a history book, and then it developed into historical fiction.
Yes.
I kind of wanted to touch on the ethics of writing about historical figures.
And I love that question. I love that question.
So there's an ethical trilemma that some writers face when writing historical fiction. How much fact, how much fiction, how to get it right, because too much fact can kill the story. Too much fiction denies history. And then not getting it right, is that unethical? Did you have any of these concerns as you wrote it, that you wanted it to be most accurate, or did you want it to be more about storytelling? How did you figure out to properly do historical fiction?
That's such a wonderful question. I never even thought about it. But let me say to you that this book is historically accurate. I took some minor dramatic licenses with some dates simply to make them fit better into telling the story. But basically, this is fact. This is what took place. I simply tried to put the characters into it and understand how they responded. And to me, if I did it to make them real as I believe they're real, I think I satisfied any ethical questions I could have.
Yeah, I think if anyone was gonna write an ethically written historical fiction, it was you, being so passionate about the Civil War and making sure it was accurate and not all a big story, to entertain your audience, although because you didn't need to add anything, it's exciting as it is.
I got a great compliment from a librarian. As it turns out, she read the book, and I was talking to her about it, and she said the first thing that came to mind were Killer Angels. Now, I don't know if you know the book or whether your members know the book, but The Killer Angels is William Shara's book. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It is the finest piece of historical fiction about the war at Gettysburg, the fight at Gettysburg, that I have ever read. I think it is a marvelous piece of work, and to have even be compared generally to that is a wonderful thing. And it's fascinating to me too, because Gettysburg was 100,000 people on each side. I live in Santa Barbara. The whole town of Santa Barbara has 100,000 people. If you can imagine two towns of the size of Santa Barbara fighting, and the battlefield was miles long. This battle was fought only with about 1,500 people on each side. It was regimental, but the battlefield was still half a mile wide. I visited Glorieta Pass because I wanted to see it. I wanted to understand it, and but the struggle is the same, and this, just as this was, called the Gettysburg of the West. It wasn't anything like Gettysburg, but it was, if the South had won this battle, they would have had access to a warm water port and a lot of valuable stuff, and it could have changed the course of the war. And it took place in Santa Fe or right outside of it.
What was it like to visit the pass? Did you get a sense of history there?
Yes and no. It's not, because it's not a single place. You're looking at it from one point of view. It's hard to figure out what's happening, but there are features that really resound in you, that I at least felt in looking at it. I loved, by the way, visited Santa Fe at the same time, and I love Santa Fe. It's what a great town that is.
I love Santa Fe too. Thank you for coming. Hope you visit us again. So what was your hardest scene to write? Was there a more difficult scene?
Oh, yes. The most difficult chapter to write, which took me a long time and which troubled me, was the death of Louisa's child of measles when they were serving in Monterey. And Edward was out on patrol. He wasn't there. And she sickened and died of this disease. And this was their only child. And it simply tore her apart. And she was a strong-willed woman. That came through from the moment we're introduced to her, from the moment I was introduced to her. I think this tore her up. I don't think she ever recovered. And I think the compassion that she felt that caused her to do what she did is directly related to that. And writing that chapter about how she felt and how she reacted when her child stopped breathing, and it was terrible.
When you write and you have to really dive deep into those very difficult scenes and chapters, how do you as an author take care of yourself and take care of your heart and come back to not being so I'm not finding the right words, but you know what I mean. How do you take?
I do, and I think it's kind of like all of us in a much larger sense. When you experience the death of a loved one, your mother, your brother, your father, I mean, the pain is great. It's not like the loss of a child, which is infinite. I can't imagine. Thank God I've never had to imagine, never had to experience it, but the pain must be, in particular, your only child, pain must be awesome. But you compartmentalize it and you finish it. It's over. It's like a burial. And then you go on.
I like to ask that to some authors. I think even if you're not writing, it's important to remember self-care, but I'm always impressed with authors who have to really get into some difficult things, and how do you do that self-care at the same time? I think that's interesting. Do you have advice for novice writers, and what's some of your biggest advice for anyone who's interested in writing historical fiction?
Plagiarize. Maybe I should explain that. But I mean it. I mean it in this sense. If you want to write, you have to be an avid reader, in my view. And when you read, you need to try to understand, and you really like a book, and you're turning the pages, you're involved in the story, it's absorbed you, it's taking you away, and you really love the book. You have to, if you want to be an author, you have to step back and say, how did the author accomplish this? What did he do? how did he paint these pictures in my mind? How does he keep me turning the pages? That's what you should plagiarize. If you learn that, you'll be a great author.
That's great advice. I love that. So you're so into the Civil War. You're probably interested in other histories and American history. Do you feel like this book accomplished your goals, or do you think you'll be writing more historical fiction or historical books in the future?
Jessica, I don't know the answer to that question because I didn't start out to write historical fiction. I simply was knocked on my heels about this battle that I didn't know anything about. And when I got into it, I learned all kinds of wonderful, they're wonderful stories here. So I love doing it. I don't know that I'll ever run into something again that affects me that way. This is the only book of historical fiction I've ever written. By the way, this is as close to literature as I think I will ever get. My other books are art world mysteries or comic novels. I like writing things that make me laugh inside. I like being there. I like playing games with my mind. But we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, David Gersh has written 7 books, including mysteries, comic novels, a book on collecting art, and this is the first historical novel. Do you have a preference? I know you just said you rather enjoy making yourself laugh, but is there a preference with your writing, or do you just like being all over the place in your genres?
I don't like to be stuck, but I like to, this is one of the interesting things about being an author. I've written a series of books that involve a former professor at the Harvard Law School who goes out into the world, and they're art world mysteries. I love the art world. I write them because it's the only way anyone will listen to me about art. But when you do that, and if you do it well, those people are living. Those people are alive for you. And I'm writing another art world mystery because I want to go back and find out what they're doing. So it's it's compelling in a very good way if you like being in your mind and you like the people you're in there with.
Okay, I'm also curious, when you were going to law school or pre-law, did you also know you wanted to be a writer, or did the passion for writing come later?
I went to trade school all my life. I studied accounting in UCLA. I got an MBA in accounting. I became a CPA. I went to law school. These are all trade schools. These are like, how do I do things? How do I make a living kind of things? I didn't have a creative bone in my body. I was functionally illiterate when I got out of Harvard. By functionally illiterate, I mean I could read, but I hadn't read fiction. Somebody gave me Giles Goatboy by John Barth. It started me on a 35-year odyssey of reading all kinds of books, and I loved it. And I didn't start writing anything. I started writing poetry when I was 32 years old. Poetry is a very different form than long form writing. It's highly emotional and it's very dense. And and interestingly, I was studying with a professor one-on-one at UCLA, and he surprised me by offering to nominate me for a Guggenheim. He thought I had a voice. That for me was a turning point in my life, because as many people I tried to blame it on for not taking that Guggenheim, I realized I didn't want to be poor. But I I had an offer to to publish a book of my poetry, which I also never did, which led me always to want to write a book. And I started, thinking about a book in, the early 90s. Didn't start writing until I quit the law in 2001. So it's been a long road, and everybody has a great poem in them. Really, everyone does. And I think anyone can be a writer. I mean, none of us perhaps are going to be Steinbeck. I certainly am not. But all of us can write and have wonderful things in us to write about. And you're writing about yourself. One of the differences in The Whisper of a Distant God and my other books is my voice in my other books is very personal. It's very much my own voice. My voice is totally absent from this book. And that was one of the hardest things to do, to leave yourself out, to put the figures and the history first to tell their own story.
Thank you for sharing. For those of you who are with us right now, feel free to raise your hand to ask a question or make a comment. You can write it in the chat or Q&A box. I can read it for you as well. This would be a great time if you have anything you'd like to add. David, what's next for your writing career? Are you already writing something right now? Are you in the works?
Yeah, I'm halfway through another installment of the Art World Mysteries, but I haven't been working on it because I keep coming back to this book because I really want to share it. It's very special to me.
Yeah, I so appreciate you sharing it and sharing it with the Santa Fe community. Barbara, you have your hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself. You are able to talk now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I've always wondered, my husband was a historian, a great interest in Glorieta, and we've never quite understood the battle. This way, it gives me great incentive to get the book. And
pleasure.
Glorieta has been an empty area in the historical history of my husband's background and myself. So the book will fill in everything I've asked, I'm sure. Thank you.
Well, I'm so glad to have done it. It was, as I said, it filled in a gap in my life too. And it was truly a horrible battle and a hard fought battle. And, but it was important. And Santa Fe is important because of it.
Thank you, Barbara. If anyone else has any comments or questions, feel free to raise your hand as well or type it in the chat. David, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your book with us and writing it and sharing all of your advice for novel authors, novice writers. It's been really great having this conversation with you. I've learned so much. I keep learning so much from these virtual programs, and I so appreciate authors like you for sharing all of this and all of your hard work. Phil has their hand raised. I will allow you to talk. Feel free to unmute yourself, Phil.
Did you unmute?
Yeah, we're unmuted.
Oh, I'm sitting here with my good friend Tim Nero, who has an art studio right across the road from the Glorieta battlefield. So this was
Actually, we're on the battlefield.
Yes, we are.
Wow.
We're sitting on the battlefield from the third day.
Not only are we sitting on it, we live on it.
Yep.
That's when the South could have won the battle. They were about, the South actually had won every engagement, and they had turned the Union commander, a very inexperienced guy, had divided up his troops and had left himself without adequate people to defend, and he had to retreat to unprepared positions from Pigeon Ranch. And they were confident that they were going to be able to turn his flanks and defeat them completely and be able to take over Fort Union when the wagon train was destroyed. So that has to be very exciting. Do you find any Civil War relics out there?
I hike the battlefield frequently, and I've never found any relics.
Yeah, and where we are, where the studio is, I've looked around with the metal detector, and I haven't found anything in the last 12 years. So it was pretty well picked over in the last 100 and some years.
I guess.
We're on the Confederate side of the battlefield, just quarter mile east of Pigeon Ranch, or west of Pigeon Ranch, excuse me. Yeah.
I loved why it was named Pigeon Ranch. Do you know that story?
Yes.
Yeah.
You want to tell us?
That wasn't his original name.
No.
Nobody.
I don't know the story. Would one of you share it?
Well,
Pigeon.
some people opine that they named him Pigeon because the way he flapped his arms when he danced at his roadhouse.
Exactly what I understand.
Yep.
He didn't he adopt a Hispanic name, but he wasn't Hispanic.
Who adopted?
Pigeon.
Ah,
His
I
original.
don't think I ever really came across his real name.
It is I've seen the placard up on the trail. I don't remember what his original name was, but his given name wasn't Pigeon, but
No.
two different schools of thought on it. One of them was that he looked like a pigeon when he was dancing. And I think
That's hilarious.
it's a beautiful part of the world.
Yeah, very, very lovely here.
I agree.
Yep.
Thanks.
If you come back out sometime, you're welcome to the property, and you can walk around this part of the battlefield if you like.
Oh, I thank you. I'd love to do that. I really would. When next time we make it out,
And we won't.
I will do that.
Okay. Well, consider you're invited.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for sharing. It's so cool that you're here and on the battlefield at the same time.
Exactly.
That's awesome. It doesn't look like anyone else has their hand raised. There's no other comments, but I'll give you another minute or so in case anyone else wants to mention anything. But David, anything else you want to share with us before we say our closing?
Yeah, I wanted to share one thing. And it's another question that I posed in the back of the book, which is shocking. Because the question is, did the South lose the Civil War? And the answer is less certain than we'd like, because, after the North won the Civil War, they sent garrisons of federal troops down to occupy the South. But in 1871, a political deal was cut to prevent Tilden from being president, and the troops were withdrawn. And that both brought in the Jim Crow era, which was quasi-slavery, certainly. And it also established the solid South in the Senate, where the South controlled, particularly in the civil rights area, any decision that was made by the US Senate. So, the North fought the war, the North won the war, but the North lost the war too, and we all lost the war in a real way.
Thank you, David. A million times thank you, David Gersh, for providing our community with this event, and of course sharing the whisper of a distant God with the world. I'm so happy you wrote this book and took a chance on a very powerful and important historical fiction novel. And I look forward to reading your other genres as well. I want to get your humorous head with your art. Everyone, you can find David Gersh's books by requesting them at your local bookstores. They are also available on many online vendors. So just Google search David Gersh author. You'll find all of his books there. And be sure to check out the Santa Fe Public Library events calendar for more of our virtual programs. Thank you, David. I hope you have a good rest of your day. This has been really wonderful. I've learned so much from you.
Oh, I've enjoyed this immensely, and I loved working with you. I thank you for having me.
Thank you. Everyone stay safe, read books, read Whispers of a Distant God, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Bye.